And one more person, I ask him to come to the front. Hi everyone, we'll just begin the next panel now. It's called Expats and Expectations on Migration and Diaspora, and our convener is Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones, who's just there, will be joining us in 1 second. And I just wanted to announce that we would like to thank the Birkbeck School of Law, who are in partnership with us for this panel, and Dr. Bruce Jones is from the School of Law. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to chair this panel. It's really a pleasure. A lot of my work is on indenture from South Asia to Jamaica and on migration. So this is a really good chance for me to get to learn from some panelists doing some exciting work. I will just introduce the panelists by kind of their titles, and they're going to introduce themselves a little bit further when they give their presentations. And we do have some PowerPoints, so the panelists are sitting here for now, and you'll see them as they come up to present. So this panel is called Expats and Expectations, which is a very provocative title, and you'll see how the papers are connected through, I think, methodologically as well as thematically, looking at diaspora communities and looking at communities within communities in various parts of the world, not only in Asia, but for example in Milan. So we have, the first talk is going to be We Can't Live Together Like Those German Faggots, Cinematic Representation of Queer Migrants from Muslim-Majority Countries Living in Europe. And that's by Dr. Gerard Coll-Planas, who is the director of the Center of Interdisciplinary Studies on Gender at the University of Vic in Catalunya. Then we'll have a talk called Queer Intersections, Voices from Expatriates and Immigrants Living in Japan. And that's by Tianqi Zhang, who's a graduate student of Integrated Sciences for Global Society from Kyushu University in Japan. We unfortunately will not hear from Rica Unico, who couldn't make it today. So we'll only have 4 presentations. So the third presentation we'll have is Coming Out of the Country, Migration and Gay Immigrants Coming Out Stories by Ping Husan Wang from Georgetown University in the United States. And finally, we'll hear From Stigma to Coping Strategies, Gay, Bi, Asian Males' Experiences and Sexual Racism in Dating Apps in Milan. And that's Massimo Modesti, who is an intercultural educationalist and researcher in anthropology based in Milan and working for a nonprofit. Is that right? So without further ado, I'll present our first panelist, Gerard Coll-Planas. One other quick administrative note from the organizers is that there's no video and audio recording unless you've already gotten permission from the organizers and the panelists, which I'm not sure if that's happened. So be sure to take discretion with that. And after the panels, we'll have a Q&A. Yeah, great. So I'll give you time for 5 minutes and 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to the organizers. This is the first time we are presenting this paper, so it will be a pleasure to receive your feedback. Well, this one, yeah. Nowadays, Muslim migrants play a central role in debates about national identity, cultural belonging, and alterity in Europe. Sexuality, and especially homosexuality, is used to promote the representation of Islam as inherently homophobic. In this context, queer migrants occupy a complex position in the intersection between Islamophobia and homophobia. This paper I'm presenting today analyzes how the tension between the two is represented in cinema. The paper stems out of a wider project called Assimilation, Hybridity and Encountering, Cinematic Representation of Queer Migrants from Muslim Background Living in Europe, although in this case focusing only on migrants from Asian countries following the scope of this conference. The films are set in the United Kingdom and Germany, and they portray queer migrants from Muslim backgrounds from Pakistan, Turkey and Iran. The object of analysis is made up of these films: My Beautiful Laundrette, Lola and Billy the Kid, East is East, Touch of Pink, Unveiled, and Evet I Do. After analyzing the films, we established 3 categories to classify them: assimilation, hybridity, and queer encounters. Despite the geographical narrowing of the sample from 18 films to 6, the same types of representation divide the movies in 3 equal groups. Due to the limitation of time, in this presentation we will focus on the analysis of 1 film per category. The first category reproduces an assimilation discourse promoting the idea that queer migrants should embrace a Western gay identity and break with their families and the values of their communities of origin. According to Georgis, the epistemology of gay liberation is linked to the modern understanding of sexuality as a truth to be discovered, and once knowable to the self, becomes incumbent upon the self to confess it to the outside world. East is East and Touch of Pink are examples of this, although the latter exemplifies better the discourse and is the center of this analysis. The main character of the film is Alim, who has a guardian angel, Cary Grant, a sort of ghost that is product of Alim's imagination. Cary verbalizes Alim's conflict and a certain Western ideology that broadens the gap between Alim's current life and the hopes of his mother. Cary represents Alim's xenophobic views, acting as some sort of colonialist voice of conscience. For example, in one of the first scenes at a gay bar, Alim expresses his incredulity when he sees his partner's parents there, wondering what would his mother's reaction be to what Cary answers. Your mom is different. She's Muslim, from the third world. She wouldn't understand. Alim, I'm Muslim, I'm from the third world. And Cary replies, but you are sophisticated, elegant young man, looking marvelous, by the way. This distance of Alim's two worlds is more evident in the coming out scene. Alim uses a sexy picture of his partner, Gilles, to explain to his mother that he's gay. This is too much for her, and she decides to go back to Canada with the rest of the family. The solution of this tangle between Alim and his mother comes when Alim decides to go to his cousin's wedding. The night before the wedding, the male cousin asks him to have sex like they used to do, while Alim's mother overhears. In this way, the movie contrasts the normative Western gay man, openly gay, in love, in a solid relationship, with the Muslim gay in denial, who cannot accept his sexuality, cheats on his wife, and tries to coerce Alim into sex. Thanks to this scene, Alim's mother realizes that his son is truly in love, accepts his gay identity, dragging him out of the closet in the middle of the wedding. The Western narrative of coming out is presented as the solution. It is not until Alim has confessed and his mother tells the whole family that Gilles and Alim can go back together for their happy ending. In the end, only by confessing publicly his sexuality and refusing to live by his family standards is Alim able to solve the initial crossroads. The films of the second group incite in an intercultural approach, establishing hybrid narratives in relation to sexual diversity that merge elements from both the country of residence and the cultural background of origin. The two examples are Lola and Billy the Kid and Eva Taidu. The analysis focuses on the first one. Lola and Billy the Kid presents a cast of characters that are at different points and distances around the limits of gender, sexuality, and nationality. For example, Lola, the protagonist, works as a drag queen and with two friends, Sherazad and Calypso. The three of them dress as women in the show, as men in their everyday lives. In fact, Calypso decides one day to start dressing as a woman full-time, and this shocks the other, but everyone respects each other's decisions. Lola's boyfriend, Billy, and his friend Iskenda work as male prostitutes. Billy is presented in the movie getting a blowjob and then beating up the client for not having the money. The separation between sex and feelings is palpable from this introductory scene and is also present in the character of Iskenda, who states that he doesn't fall in love, although he finally will. Billy is unhappy with his relationship with Lola because they are both male. In one of the scenes, he states, "We can't live together like those German faggots. We must live like totally normal people, like husband and wife." That's because of his impossibility of acknowledging desire for male that Billy puts pressure on Lola to have sex reassignment surgery to go back to Turkey as a heterosexual family. So, while doing sex work for men and having a sexual affective relationship with Lola seems acceptable for him, living as a gay couple, assimilating to the Western model, is indeed a problem for him. But Lola thinks that surgery is not the solution to their situation and can even result in Billy leaving her. Imagining this hypothetical future, Lola says, "Why do you think Billy the Kid left Lola? Because the woman who he had married was not the man who he fell in love with." We also have Lola's brothers, the young Germanized Murat, that is closer to what we understand as a gay identity model, and Osman, an aggressive man whose homophobic violence we will later find out that is related to his impossibility to acknowledge his own desire for men. The dichotomies of male-female, gay-straight, gay-transgender, or even German-Turkish are blurred throughout the movie. The characters occupy different positions in the spectrum and negotiate differently their identity. All these different positions regarding their identities are what makes this text fascinating and a perfect site to investigate hybridity and ambivalence in this depiction of sexuality and culture. The movie presents these characters' identities as fluid, reacting differently in different contexts. This chorus of identities that coexist in the film complicates the idea of a fixed and simple identity in which sexuality of culture have to prevail over the other. The films in this last group do not intend to create a realistic approach, but a metaphorical one, in which the relationship between a queer migrant and a local is taken as a political statement against homophobia and xenophobia. My Beautiful Laundrette is one clear example of this, but our analysis will focus on the more recent Unveiled. Both denounce and criticize homophobia and xenophobia instead of focusing on the problem of coming out or living one's queer identity. These movies also create utopian spaces, heterotopias, which for Foucault are something like countersides, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which all the other sides that can be found within the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Such spaces can be found in Freer's Laundrette and in Unveiled's residence, spaces of encounter that become places for protection, healing, and desiring. A bubble amidst a context of violence and exclusion. Unveiled explores the trip to Germany of Fariba, a lesbian Iranian translator who, escaping from Iranian authorities, ends up detained in Germany as an illegal migrant. After spending some time pending her admission into the country and knowing that she will be returned to Iran, she decides to take the identity of a male political refugee who has committed suicide in the detention center. Assuming his identity becomes the passport that Fariba needs to enter Germany, and she starts living in this new life as a man. Despite the potential contradictory elements of Fariba's position, a woman living as a man, a lesbian in a straight relationship with a woman, a migrant but with a total mastery of local culture, Unveiled builds the script not around the conflict between sexuality and religion, which is almost non-existent, but through a denunciation of xenophobia in Germany, the deplorable conditions of illegal immigrants, or the constant fear of being found out. State xenophobia is highlighted through the different characters like police agents, airport officers, or the immigration agents that search for illegal workers in the factory where she works. This heterotopian approach is highlighted by Fariba's encounter with Anne, a German woman. Although Anne approaches Fariba thinking that she is a man, she will later find out the truth without no surprise or conflict. We never see on camera Fariba's coming out, and it's not important at all in the movie. The relationship allows them to create a human bond in a context of xenophobia, and however, at the end of the film, the bubble will burst due to the same xenophobic forces. As we have shown, some of the movies focus on the Western gay narrative of coming out and accepting homosexuality as an essential identity, as well as presenting sexuality clashing with Islam, tradition, and family values. The films adopting a hybrid discourse present an in-between space that allow the characters to negotiate the aforementioned dichotomies. Instead of discovering an essential identity denying the values of their culture of origin, as in the previous category, these films present creative characters that explore their desire beyond pre-established paths. Whereas the previous categories focus on the problems of inhabiting such crossroads, in the films in the queer encounter category, avoid dealing with the subjective dimension in order to focus on denouncing structural xenophobia and suggesting the potential of queer relationships as heterotopias. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gerard. And now we'll hear from Tianqi Zhang.
Morning, everyone. It's such a privilege to standing here. So first of all, I would like to say this study is still underdeveloped. So in that sense, it may not present a holistic view about experiences of queer expats or immigrants living in Japan, but I hope it can somehow present an overview about their experiences. Okay, so the title is Queer Intersections, Voices from Expatriates and Immigrants Living in Japan. So queer movement in Japan has been going smoothly for the past few years. People's acceptance towards queer people has been increasing over the years. Moreover, the LGBTQ+ community seems to get more attention in mainstream media. As a result, some progress has been made, particularly in terms of visibility of queer individuals and efforts for marriage equality. This achievement may be credited to Tokyo Rainbow Pride, the largest annual queer event in Japan. The parade has not only raised awareness of visibility of LGBT individuals and a community in Japan, but also offered a platform to educate people about LGBTQ+ issues through a variety of activities such as LGBT Benkyokai, LGBT studying meetings, or LGBT talk shows, among other events. Moreover, the event was well supported by politicians and lawmakers, including Akie Abe, the First Lady of Japan, who participated and demonstrated her support at the 2014 Tokyo Rainbow Pride. Tokyo Rainbow Pride also serves as a platform for various institutions and organizations to collaborate and provide information to the public. For example, the embassies of queer-friendly countries provided information about LGBTQ+ history and queer-friendly policies of their countries to booth visitors. Also, Stonewall Japan, an international organization affiliated with the JET program, approached new members, particularly queer foreigners living in Japan, at the Pride in order to provide an English-speaking queer community group. Given the emergence of globalization and migration, there has been a gradual increase in the number of foreigners visiting or living in Japan. As of December 2015, there were more than 2.6 million foreigners resides in Japan, and according to a survey by Dentsu, also in 2015, 7.6% of Japanese population identify themselves as LGBT. So it is likely that a certain number of queer expatriates living in Japan are also LGBT. Stonewall Japan alone has recruited more than 2,000 members. However, will this achievement in queer movement in Japan make the life of these expatriates or immigrants easier? So in terms of current studies, a number of studies have examined individuals' lives in Japan from various aspects through ethnographic approaches, male homosexuality in contemporary Japan, bullies, or LGBT youth at school in Japan, and life stories of sexual minorities in Japan. However, most of these studies exclusively focus on Japanese queer individuals. As a result, there is not much existing literature that examines the life experiences issues of non-Japanese queer individuals. However, in a recent study, Bodenet argued that masculine portrayal of white American men and feminine portrayal of Asian men in gay magazines contributes to racism and xenophobia occurring in gay dating scene in Shinjuku Nichome. This shed some light on issues of non-Japanese queer individuals and communities. In order to understand these issues, it is important to utilize an intersectional approach which perceives identity as complex sets of intersections that mutually constitute in relationship to prevailing social norms. Therefore, by illustrating life stories of queer foreigners in Japan, I aim to unveil the intersection of gender, sex, sexuality, and race in the life of queer expats and immigrants, as well as issues they have with Japanese and non-Japanese queer communities. In addition, I seek to investigate the involvement of queer foreigners in LGBT movement in Japan. So in order to have a better understanding of queer expats' life experience in Japan, a quantitative approach was used for this project. By conducting in-depth interview, it enables to elicit rich information from the perspective of particular individuals and on a selected topic under investigation, as well as to seek deep information and knowledge through respondent stories. So in the end, 6 queer non-Japanese individuals were interviewed between early November 2016 and May of 2017. 3 of them were graduate students from university in different areas of Japan. 2 of them were English teachers at Japanese secondary schools, and 1 of them was working as a staff member at the National University in Tokyo. Interview was semi-structured, conducted on campus, at cafe shop, or over the internet. The interview sessions were between 2 and 3.5 hours long and recorded with the consent of the respondents. And also, among the respondents, 5 of them are cisgender, and 1 of them is a genderqueer. So what is the involvement in queer community? What is their involvement in queer community in Japan? It is noticed that prior to coming to Japan, most of the respondents did not have much previous engagement with a queer group back in their homeland. Born and raised in Jamaica, where homosexuality is illegal and a life-threatening matter, Gabriel had never heard about any local queer-related activism or groups. Fernando, still closeted to his parents at the time, was not aware of existence of queer clubs on campus, and as he commuted from home to university every day. And he did not come to terms with his sexuality until he was in university. Although there were there was a queer student union at the university, and there was posters and flyers on campus promoting the group. He was not involved in it at all, as he did not consider himself very political, nor did he take LGBTQ issues as a major part of his life. On the contrary, Joey went to the queer student group in his university. However, he was intimidated by his first and only visit there because of their unfriendliness. But apart from that, he was also concerned about his lack of knowledge on LGBTQ issues at that time. On the other hand, some respondents are more active in queer community back their hometowns. Alex was quite involved in queer-related groups since their high school years. They also took a part in Trouble's student group, a place for students who were considered different to come together and socialize. They were also one of the founding members of the LGBTQ Pride in their hometown. Kathy went to all-female student Catholic school since kindergarten. She also learned feminism in her high school and selected gender and queer-related courses at university. As a student who majored in cinema and theater, she met a number of queer students through her activism and at the university. But having stayed in Japan for a while, all of the participants had some more or less involvement with the local queer community. Joe has become a core member of an online community for queer foreigners in Japan. Fernando and Gabriel had recently participated in their first ever parade in Kyushu area, and Gabriel had been actively participating in the volunteering at the local queer-related event. Alex has been associated with the committee of Nagoya Pride and had helped the organization of the translation of the Pride pamphlet and website into English. Besides, they had also been raising the awareness of queerness in their local community by lobbying staff of their universities as well as local ventures to put LGBT ally flags in supporting queer rights. Kathy, although was not directly involved in any queer organization, had been constantly working on her research on transgendered Filipino entertainers who are working in Japan. Moreover, she had incorporated gender and LGBT-related issues in her teaching at the language school in Tokyo. Andy, who now is working as the faculty member at the National University in Tokyo, has initiated a queer group for faculty members and has presented a booth for his group at Tokyo Rainbow Pride since 2016. More recently, he's also involved in a project of promoting same-sex marriage in Japan together with lawyers and politicians in Tokyo. Because of a time limitation, I will just present 2 case studies. So, in terms of being queer expats in Japan, many of the respondents stated their motivation in getting involved with their queer activism in Japan was derived from a desire in seeking for queer community. However, their engagement in queer communities does not prevent them from struggling with their identities. Fernando decided to be out and proud when he came to Japan to study for the second time. However, it did not work out the way he had planned to some extent. He felt that he was back to the closet again. Although a number of people have known about his sexuality, the majority of them were Westerners. Moreover, he didn't feel comfortable to talk about his sexuality in front of other people, particularly his Chinese and Japanese classmates, as he noticed that the conservativeness in their conversations. On the other hand, the boyfriend he's dating at this moment, who's Chinese, was reluctant to come out and usually referred to themselves as friends or roommate when they were seen together. Before dating his current boyfriend, Fernando had used dating applications to meet other gay men. During his exploration of online dating, he noticed that there is a paradox in his whiteness, as some Asian people are fond of it, while some other simply rejected him because of his whiteness. He has also found a lot of profile of Japanese gay men stating that they would be dating exclusively Japanese men. For these reasons, many guys he ended up to meet or date online were not Japanese, but most of them are foreigners and most of them are closeted. Kathy stated her involvement with Japan's queer scene started with her work as a camerawoman for an LGBT activist in Shinjuku Nichome. With her work, she also established network with other queer people and met her current partners through mutual friends. However, she has noticed that many queer women she met in Shinjuku Nichome would not show up anymore once they had a stable relationship. Regarding discrimination, Kathy said she didn't experience much, probably because she does not talk much about her private life with other people. However, quite often she would ask if she was married to a Japanese man because of her last name. On the other hand, although Kathy was born and raised in the Philippines, because of her Japanese lineage and having been living in Japan for over a decade, she felt that she had been Japanized and to some degree fit in Japanese society. She also expressed that she was getting more and more interested in queer issues in Japan since she had the Japanese partner. Over the years, she witnessed changes and progress of queer movement in Tokyo. However, she thinks it's still difficult to live in countryside in Japan, as the environment there is relatively conservative. Therefore, she and her partner are not out to many people when they are living together. So, drawing the conclusion, it is indisputable that queer movement in Japan had made some progress in terms of visibility of queer individuals and embracing diversity. It is quite common to see a number of Western faces at Tokyo Rainbow Pride. However, it is rarely to find these faces appearing in other Pride events such as LGBT-related lectures and symposiums. Apparently, there are still disconnection between community, as Alex noticed that queer expats are yearning for a queer community, yet they are not willing to build one on their own, nor they are willing to go to Japanese queer community because of the need of putting extra effort. Meanwhile, as mentioned previously, some queer expatriates are involved in cultivating queer community in Japan, especially among those who are access to institutional support. Well, a number of respondents consider queer neighborhood as a safe harbor, yet discrimination can be found both outside and inside the queer community. In society, people may subconsciously ask questions based on heteronormativity. Through the conversation with my respondents, it seems that such heterosexism is still prevailing in public space, such as schools, workplace, and countryside. Discriminations are also extended to queer community. A number of respondents mentioned a clear gender division regarding men's only and women's only queer parties. Apart from it, Bodinate noticed xenophobic experience among Chinese and Korean gay sojourners who participated in Japan's gay dating scenes in Shinjuku Nichome. Meanwhile, such racial issue can be also applied to the online dating scene. Skanuma argued that there is always a complex mixture of local and global current in the queer culture. Therefore, it is important to break down the binary of Japan West, local, global, in the context of globalization. To be specific, queer movement cannot be accomplished by focusing on certain identity or categories, but on the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, age, and other issues. What can be seen here is that involvement of queer expatriates in queer community in Japan, However, it is not underpinned by the idea of West advanced, Japan backward. On the other hand, as Andy commented, if you want to really achieve any sort of long-lasting change, then it has to come from within. Just cultural imperialism and foreigners imposing what they believe is universal. Human rights on the Japanese is Okay, I will read the sentence one more time. If you want to really achieve any sort of long-lasting change, then it has to come from within. Just cultural imperialism and foreigners imposing what they believe is universal human rights on Japanese is obviously wrong. Therefore, it is important to acknowledge the coexistence of diversified culture and identities on the road to a better queer community. The process of respecting and learning from different cultures and identities would be a possible solution to break down the internal and external barriers and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tianqi. And now I'll introduce the third talk, Migration and Gay Immigrants Coming Out Stories by Ping Swan Wang.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Coming from Taiwan and going to the United States for school as a gay immigrant, this question becomes more relevant than ever. What is coming out? I remember sitting across the room from a therapist during a counseling session. I was put on the spot by her question. When did you first come out to yourself? Maybe we can all think about this question for a few seconds. You might have a number in your mind, an age. Back then, I did not know how to answer that question. In fact, I might still not have an answer because I might have come out to some of my friends, my family, but why would I need to come out to myself? I always knew that I was gay. Maybe it was because of my cultural background. Apparently, there was a discrepancy between my understanding of coming out and my therapist. This prompted me to ask more questions, including what does coming out mean to gay immigrants? How do gay immigrants come out in the US? And how do they see themselves in their own coming out stories? So basically, how coming out is a process, as most of us have come to understand, linguistically expressed and reflected. How is it revealed in language? So I looked at narratives, especially coming out stories, because according to Schifrin, we verbalize and situate our experience as text, both locally and globally. And narrative provides a resource for the representation of personal and social identity. So we situate past events locally by making it relevant to the here and now when talking to an audience. And at the same time, we make our personal experience globally situated by referring to our cultural knowledge. And in the study, I borrow the concept or reconceptualization that Russ proposed, says of coming out as an ongoing dynamic process of describing one's social location within a changing social context. This is especially important in my study because my participants, as well as I, are situated in this intersection where we are in the social context where we are both gay men, and immigrants in the US. And also coming out should be, should be conceived of as a communicative process. As Jen and Darcy argue, interaction with other homosexuals facilitates the learning of vocabulary that not only explains but justifies homosexual behavior. So by interacting with other people or the community, the local community, immigrants learn what it means to come out in a new environment. So I interviewed 10 gay immigrant men who are immigrants, who live in the US. And in my thesis, my master's thesis, I focus on interviews with these 4 Indian men. And in the presentation today, we will look at 3 examples. And they spent varying amount of time in the US. And as a linguist, I look at narratives with this theoretical construct, 3 levels of narrative positioning, how they position themselves in storytelling. So level 1 positioning deals with story characters positioned to one another in a story world, so it's in the past. Level 2 positioning has more to do with what's happening right now in the storytelling events. So it's a storyteller positioning himself or herself to the audience, the story recipient, in their interaction. Whereas level 3 positioning has more to do with the cultural backdrop, the storyteller positioning against the cultural backdrop. And there are 3 parts of my analysis in my thesis. And for the presentation today, we will be looking at the second part, changing social context, and how they use language or linguistic strategies to reenact, to dramatize their migration, their movement from one country to another. In excerpt 1, we will see Daksh expresses that coming out was a new concept that was absent in India. He was later introduced to what it means to come out in the US. He reenacts the process whereby he had learned about coming out in a form of dialogue. And then he establishes a connection between his migration from India to the US and his obtaining the concept of coming out. So we will look at the transcript. So in response to my question, when did you first have the idea of coming out? Daksh says, when I came to the US, because when I came to the US, that's when the whole idea of coming out came to me. Because back where I grew up, there was no concept of coming out. Even if you identify yourself as gay, it wasn't something there wasn't a concept called coming out. So in the very beginning, he puts it out front like there was nothing called coming out. Even if he was well aware of his attraction to other men, there was no such thing as coming out for him to express, to talk about his feelings. So I think when I was coming to the US, and I think a year and a half after I was here, I met like-minded people, and they basically, you just talk to me about, are you out? Did you come out to someone? And that's where he constructs dialogue. He voices the people who ask him questions. And then, after that, in line 16 and 17, he voices himself by saying, what does it mean? What do you mean coming out? And in the story world, at level 1, he is positioning himself vis-a-vis other story characters, which are his friends back then, as, knowledgeable versus not unknowing, like knowing versus not knowing. So he was the less knowledgeable one when it comes to coming out. He did not know what coming out means. And this was the process being reenacted as we previously just saw Jane and Darcy's argument that encountering and interacting with other people in the community, individuals come to learn what it means to come out. And later he recaps this experience of his. And basically that's when I realized, oh, there's like a thing called coming out. Telling your friends and family is coming out. So line 20 and 21 are where he voices his inner thoughts like, oh, this is what's happening in my mind. This is going through my thinking process, and that's how he positioned himself in relation to me as someone who has come along this way and learned, okay, so this is coming out. Now I know what's coming out, and I have come out as a gay man in the US. In excerpt 2, we see Reyansh focuses on a different dimension of coming out in the US. He justifies his action of not coming out in India by situating himself in a hypothetical scenario. And we can also see in this example that physical locations is, again, tied to social locations, or vice versa, social locations reflected in the changing physical locations. So Reyansh says coming out in the US is different than coming out for somebody in India, or coming out in some other places where homosexuality is still not something that is way accepted. And I guess said also it doesn't really matter because there are no benefits tied to you being you coming out. So what does he mean by benefits? Even if you're out in India, it doesn't really mean you get any benefits, any kind of financial benefits, or then you can still get married, that you can get all of your spouse's benefits. So it seems that here he is making reference to the legalization or the legislation of same-sex marriage in the US, as opposed to, there's no legislation, regulation in India pertaining to same-sex marriage. So that means, in his opinion, coming out as a gay man doesn't really give him the benefits he would have had in the US, and therefore he downplays the significance or importance of coming out in India. And And the last example we'll see, Origin's story makes salient the difference in social context over time, so temporal change. He likewise explains why he did not come out until he left India for the US. And he verbally represents the word-of-mouth tradition of the tight-knit social network in his hometown. And that's where positioning level 3 comes in. He reflects on the cultural knowledge in India in his cultural background. He says, at that time, I did not want to come out to anybody. This was nobody at that point. There was no concept of coming out. So again, you see that reappearing in his story. There was no openly gay man in the college, that's changed now though. I ran into a fellow college mate of mine a few years junior to me, that he was openly out, and he was like, yeah, people have come out when they're in college. I said, good for you. That was unthinkable back then. So here, by recounting this experience of his, he's showing me that there has been a change in India, just in India, not just the regional difference between the US and India, but just simply in India, like back then when he was in college, and now there has been a shift in attitude toward gay men. So coming out was a possibility only after I came to the US. I asked him, what do you think is that? Good question. Well, to friends, I almost did a few times, but there was nothing to fall on it if it did not go well. But I knew that distance was a safety net. So it's like if it doesn't go well, it doesn't go well, and I'm halfway across the world. Life's still going on. And that's how he justified to me that, okay, coming out, it's more of a possibility, an option in the US for him. Back then, part of the thing I was scared about was, so let's say, again, like a hypothetical scenario, I come out to my friends, and if it doesn't go well, or if they talk about it to their parents, my parents knew their parents, so it's like, well, eventually, come back to my folks. And that I could not even imagine. And so, that was not even an option. So we can see the progression of the information flow and how he describe the social network he was in back in India. So if he came out to his friends, that would eventually go to their parents and his parents, and then his whole family, relatives, and that's how he discursively construct this social network that he believes it hinders his coming out back in India. So just some concluding remarks. All three participants reenact the vicissitudes of their personal experiences, and by positioning at different levels, whether it's in the story world or in the interaction, by explaining to me what it is like to come out in India versus what it's like to come out in the US. They invite me to relive their transitions from one country to another. And also they construct a dialogue, like what we just saw in the first example, to make sense of this drastic shift in their lives and restore the continuity of self, connecting and making relevant the past to the present. Like Schifrin's argument, we tell stories to make relevant to our experiences, both locally and globally. And last but not least, pretty similar to like going back to the question that I was asked in the beginning of this presentation, what I experienced was also a disconnect between, being a gay man in Taiwan versus being a gay man in the US. Storytelling, in our cases, is a way or a means we bridge this disconnect between before and after migration, create a coherent sense of self over time, and highlight their, and also my, gay identities in the US. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Ping. And last, we have From Stigma to Coping Strategies, Gay, Bi, Asian Males Experience and Sexual Racism in Dating Apps in Milan by Massimo Modesti.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Buongiorno a tutti e a tutte. Magandang umaga po, if there are Filipinos here. Zhang. I'm sorry, because this morning I will not present exactly the paper. It's on the online program. I'm not an academic. I'm a PhD, but working in a non-profit organization. And I started this study in 2015, just doing it in my spare time. So I will present the online part, not the offline experience of gay and bisexual Asians in Milan. This study started from accounts from my friends telling me about being refused because of race or nationality on dating apps. And this made me curious about this phenomenon, and I started reading some studies made by scholars in the US and Australia. And I wanted to explore this phenomenon in the Italian context. Just to give you a background of Italy and Milan, particularly considering the migrations, is quite recent. They started in the late 70s. And we now have the first LGBT generation of children of immigrants at the moment. On the other side, there are many students, particularly from China, coming to Milan for study design, fashion design, and architecture and arts. And those are part of the informants I met on an online platform called Planet Romeo. Why did I choose Planet Romeo instead of Jack D or instead of Grindr? It's because to have an interaction, a long interaction on the online, I interviewed these people messaging on the instant messaging system. You cannot have a real conversation on Grindr, as you So it's just a fast hookup app. But on the other side, as one young gay Italian told me, the Planet Romeo is prehistoric. Yes, it's prehistoric, but on the other side, you can have a conversation, a real conversation. My purpose. Oh, sorry. I won't follow exactly the slides, but I will tell you something else. You have some information about my research. My purpose was that of exploring how much stigmatization and fetishizations by the majority white group these young Asian guys experience in their daily use of dating apps. I asked myself, how do they frame and reframe this experience of sexual racism? If someone doesn't know what sexual racism is, racism basically on the field of selecting a sexual or romantic partner. And how much it affects their daily life, how they frame and reframe, which sense they give to this experience, if they recognize it is or not. And so I started with online written conversation. I interviewed 17 Asian Italians users who were 19 to 29 years old, permanently living in Milan or in the surroundings. And I started. I went directly to the topic because of you can know exactly what's going on after if someone will engage or not in the conversation. So I started asking, did you experience any discrimination or racism or refusal because of your nationality or race on hookup app and in gay dating? And the background of immigration. The Filipino community is the first for number in Milan with 40,000 people. The third one is the Chinese. We have South Asians, particularly from India and Sri Lanka. So most of the informants were of Chinese or Filipino heritage or Chinese and Filipino nationals. They experienced 11 out of 17 were refused, but only 4 indicates the clear reasons why. 3 of them, they were insulted because of race, openly insulted, like fuck off Chinese or something like that, Chinese dog. Starting from these, their accounts, I identified 4 main topics. The one is the first one is the just a preference, the naturalization of racial aesthetic hierarchies. 5 out of 17 think that racial preference is not sexual racism. The process through which they demonstrate is the naturalization of Western supremacy in the beauty norm. It's normal, they say. It's normal, consider it the framework, but sometimes they don't consider the framework or the background of this, considering normal that the white Western male is the standard of beauty. And very little was said about why Western and white males are considered at the top of the hierarchy, and about the cultural and power dynamics that brings to this normal naturalization. Someone mentioned arts and media of a specific cultural area, for example, but in conclusion they say it's natural. It's natural, like someone says, like being heterosexual or homosexual, like it's a taste, it's simply a taste. So they don't generally consider racism part of them, but 2 of them, for example, felt offended by reading "No Asians" on the taglines of users. The second topic is gendering, sexuality, and race. What does it mean exactly? Who is the real man? Who is the top of masculinity? Most of my informants don't mention why Asian bodies are considered unattractive, for example, by the white Italian men. Three explicitly mention the reasons hidden behind the racial preference: small dicks, easy maybe, no bird, slim and thin bodies, few muscles, smooth, not well endowed. It seems that there is a line on one side there is the top of masculinity, and on the other side there is the lower grade of masculinity in this imagery. So assuming that Asian people are not masculine enough is a statement based on the Western model of masculinity and gender aesthetic stereotypes. Reading some of the accounts of 25 years old interviewed in English, personally speaking, I found Asians more passive and feminine compared to other Westerners. Why do a lot of foreigners come to Asian countries think there are a lot of gays, while they are not? Another one, 26 years old, interviewed in Italian, he said, yes, in my opinion, masculinity is a matter of the following features: beard, muscles, hair. From what I can remember from my past studies, the ancient Greeks defined the aesthetic canons and exalted the body build of muscular athlete. As a consequence, other people follow these canons. These informants think that beauty norms were imposed by the dominance of Western culture, but they don't discuss or contest it, for example. And they are not really aware of the colonial heritage, for example, behind this. The third topic is the ideal gay Asian. Someone said, 25 years old, if there is a straight-looking and very muscular Asian, he will get a lot of attention from Western guys, whether like Asians or not. In general, gay guys want to meet other straight-acting and looking guys. So when an Asian guy, considering these informants, fits the dominant beauty and masculinity norms, he suddenly becomes attractive. So it's not just the physical features that make an attractive or attractive an Asian man, but how far he is from the hegemonic model of masculinity, how much he fits heteronormativity in gender performance. So those who are excluded from this standard are the orientalized, fetishized, the feminized, bottomized. This was just an hypothesis, because as you could see from the second part of the research is how they challenge, and this is the fourth topic, how they react and challenge and the sexual racism. I found that the strategies were justification, as I said before, is just a preference, or for example, they are uneducated people, so they insulted me just because they were bored or full, not just because there is racism in a dominant culture or in the subcultures. Negation, there is no racism, we are all on the same level, everyone experiences discrimination. On gay chat this is true, but there are differences if it's based on race or not. Irony, one of the guys told me, usually people here look for friends with benefits, and everyone has his own preference: bear, slim, hairy, fetish, PC, blonde, Asians, no Asians. Bears make me sick, then in my opinion, Asian is a taste, no Asian is a bad taste. This one also asked me, but in your opinion, couldn't they be attracted by anything else in me, not only my race? Another strategy is questioning. Someone experimented, for example, putting the photos of a white man instead of his own photos and seeing how many messages I receive, some of the informants. Some is understanding the roots in the European context of beauty hierarchies. pride, someone avoided to discuss, saying just, I'm proud to be Chinese, for example. Going to discussions, those who negate or those who consider secular racism, both the positions are a position in which there is something behind these dynamics on the dating apps experience connected to race. Someone said it's not. Another strategy was that a friend says, "Oh, this is not our business. It's something coming from the U.S., for example." And it's true. On one side, there is a global culture about that, and people, especially young people, they are into a global gay culture. Representations of Asian beauty on media, on Italian media, we don't have in the cinema, on the TV, a representation of the Asian beauty in the mainstream, and also queer, on the queer magazines, on the queer, there is no, it seems that there are no LGBT Asians in Italy. Also the label Asians, I realized it's a problematic because sometimes when you create a profile is the only, you cannot put others, so someone is taking and use it as a self-representation, but it's full of stereotypes, this representation on gay apps. So instead of saying I'm Filipino or I'm, I don't know, something else. So those who are not passively accepting the role and the image reproduced by the dominant heterosexist and Orientalist narrative, what are the counter-narratives they use to subvert the dominant discourse, for example? And is there a dominant discourse in Italy about that or not? A narrative, a dominant narrative? So not bottomized, not fetishized, so what? And this is the second part of I already did 7 interviews about the offline experience of dating, for example. One of the last times I presented this study was at the UP, the University of the Philippines in Quezon City, Manila, and I was very interested in seeing what's the reaction of young activists from there. And for example, in that context, I realized which is something different, but one of the strategies young people use to escape the label given to homosexuals by the popular culture, for example, is because the popular culture is considered a gay man as a effeminate or cross-dresser. So they use the label bisexual to put a distance from this imagery and to reconnect it to their masculinity. But it's not about sexual orientation, it's about identity. They use the... last thing, I'm thinking about the colonization of the mind. It is something that affects the migrants, and exploring the Filipino context, for example, I realized that there's something which is transmitted through generations, and so migrants bring with them, the colonization of the mind is not something that happened in Milan, in Italy, but it's something that happened long ago and before, and it's affecting also children of immigrants. So the fact of, for example, the trends for being faith and masculine, which is a globalized culture, gay culture, but it's very, very, I realize it's very, there are young people who are killing themselves, especially in the Philippines, for getting muscular and big. And this is reproduced in the culture of beauty pageants, for example, who are very popular in Milan, in the Filipino community. This is not. This is quite different from the Chinese, which has a totally different context. So I'm reflecting on these topics to give to go a step forward with my exploration, which is the comparing the online, which is where the stereotyping is very easy, with the offline experience of Asian young guys in Milan. Thank you very much. I forgot this is just my context, and the rainbow mug is from a LGBT Christian church from the Philippines.
Congratulations.
No, thank you. Was it clear?
Yeah,
enough?
yeah,
Was it clear enough?
I'm stimulating.
Oh, thank you very much.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for these really interesting papers. And I'm just going to make a couple of very short comments that should take 2 seconds, and then we'll get to the Q&A, and we'll go until about 12:30. These papers are really interesting, and the way that they fit together, I think, is more interesting than I had predicted, just seeing the titles. One of the things that I think cuts through the papers is the approach, and that's, I guess, not that they have the same approach, but that they're engaging with similar ideas in the approach. So engaging with space and the spatial in a very particular type of way, I think is really interesting. And that connects to, I think, something what Gerard brought up in his presentation about hybridity and the idea that these spaces are somehow able to open us up to thinking quite differently, but very context-based about the situations. So spaces in terms of physical spaces where we're located, but also spaces of communication, which includes the media, includes online, includes film, and it also includes the way that we understand ourselves temporally. So that was really interesting, Ping, in your presentation, to look at how people regard themselves within their own history and how that history is actually a part of their present as well. How you've negotiated as an interviewer your identity alongside of the people you're interviewing, I think, is also a matter of approach. The methods, I think, were also overlapping but quite distinct in some ways. So from a literary type of analysis with film and the flexibility that gives us to work with symbols and metaphors, to a very sociological analysis, I think, with your piece, which looks at, certain factors of the group that you're interviewing and tries to map somehow those factors onto how it affects the result, to a linguistic approach, which I thought was a good turn. I wish I were a linguist because I'm secretly obsessed with languages, but I'm not really great at understanding linguistics. And that helps also to look at a very particular term, which I think is a very specific way of looking at a series of conversations through the lens of this term, which I think at some point you said there was a making sense of a drastic shift in people's lives by using the term coming out as a pivotal, moment of inquiry. And having different stages to the language of that conversation is really interesting. So focusing on language very concretely. And then to Massimo's presentation, which is, I think, also focused on language, that allows us to see kind of the panoply of ways in which racism works. And sexual racism, which I think is an interesting term, but it's almost, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you think about the usefulness of the term, because a lot of what was described could have been in other contexts as well. But that's just a provocation because I'm not really familiar with the use of sexual racism as a separate term. But the fear and desire located in a lot of what we saw in your presentation was really able to be mapped onto other forms of racism in society outside of the the app world. But then when you talked about the colonization of the mind, I think that also draws a link through a lot of the presentations in terms of how people aren't only battling against these types of exclusions, but also including them in the way that they've gone through the world in some ways. So it might be interesting to, I don't know, to have that be maybe even a more explicit part of the analysis across the papers. So we'd like to open up for questions, and I guess we have lots. I saw a hand over there first, and then here. Oh, wow.
I'll just ask a question later.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, you already have a mic. Okay, so here and then next.
Hi, thank you so much for the papers. This is a question for Ping, and although we're pressed for time, if anybody else would like to kind of respond to it, then I'd also be very happy to hear from you. It seemed that you kind of took a fairly rigid idea of what coming out could mean and kind of tested it against the experience of the people that you were, of your interlocutors. And what I'm interested in is whether that kind of bounce back, whether you learn anything from them about alternative ways of understanding identification or kind of selfhood or self-understanding. Did that happen? What did you learn from them?
Maybe we could take a few questions and then we can fit in some more.
I'm expanding on Ella, so it's just a very short comment. You know, one of the things that came out was the colonization of the mind, but we also have to be aware of the colonization of the mind of the researcher and how guilty and how culpable we are in replicating, reproducing the language of racism and violence in the studies that we do. So when we do ethnographic studies, you know, we keep a distance and we say that we are holding up a mirror, you know, and this question comes up a lot, you know, and it also came up yesterday when there was a gay dating panel when we talk about the ethics of representation. When we are sitting in the audience hearing a panelist talking about certain kinds of language that is used to denigrate a certain race, you know, it's in a way replicating that kind of violence or reliving that kind of violence that you encounter on dating apps. And if it's going to be fossilized on paper and it's going to be taken up, and you know the paper that you release into the world is going to get reproduced and quoted and cited in various other forms, how do you negotiate with that as a researcher, and how would you navigate?
We had a hand here, and then we had a question here, and then I'll get back to the middle. Oh, your hand. Sorry.
I was only here for the last two papers, but I just want to clarify, because it seemed like we were running on an assumption. I just want to clarify. Were you talking about cisgender gay men, like people who have been told they're a man all their life and they still identify as that? Or are you talking about a broader range of men?
Okay, and we have two questions. One question here and one question in the middle.
Yeah, I guess, thank you to the all-male panel on migration. But yes, I guess I just wanted to do one quick mention. A few of us are volunteering for Rainbow Pilgrims. So if you're a queer migrant here in Britain from a faith background, if you look up Rainbow Pilgrims and want to tell your personal narrative, that'd be great. But my question is for Mr. Zhang. I thought your paper was, your idea was really fascinating because you're studying migrants to a non-Western country. But I was wondering if maybe like you had the idea of one of the migrants being rejected because of his whiteness. I was wondering if that could be interrogated more, especially since, you know, a native in Japan, maybe they're choosing not to negotiate these kind of complex power dynamics or understanding what a racialized gay identity is coming from the West. And also at your conclusion, you talk about exchanging information, but I think that idea can also be interrogated since it's obvious that exchange of information is not equal, especially what Massimo mentioned, this kind of gay male pornography industry under late capitalism, which celebrates one kind of racialized body type, fetishizes, erases all other kinds. So I was wondering if you were considering that. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a fourth question, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
Questions for speaker 1 and 2. Sorry for quantifying you. First one, the most recent film that you discussed is made in 2008. I was wondering why you chose specifically 80s, 90s, and can you reflect on cinematic representations of queer migrants in the past 10 years? Because it's almost 10 years since the most recent film that you've discussed. Second speaker, I think the dynamic of migrant queer in Japan is very interesting because of the position of migrants in Japan in general. It's a work in progress, so maybe you can take this as comments or questions. So this is based on Japan's long anti-migrant politics, as well as family registration system in Japan, which means that you can become, it's extremely hard to get citizenship, and you can get it only if you prove your Japanese lineage through ancestry. And so the migrants in Japan, in a way, never fully get integrated into the socio-cultural system, which grants them a space for otherness and queerness, which means that also the migrants in Japan might have more space than the native Japanese to go against the normative socio-cultural setting. The third issue is on Shinzo Abe's, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's policies, and you mentioned that policymakers now are including more LGBT. Akiya Abe, Prime Minister's wife, appeared in LGBT in 2014. I don't know if she's appeared since then, but yes, exactly. So what is the link between this promotion of LGBT rights on the one hand, and on the other, Shinzo Abe's extremely right-wing and conservative policies and assertion of heteronormative gender roles and family, which is an outcome of, among other things, declining population and aging population. And also, some years ago, one of Shinzo Abe's ministers, health minister, called women birthing machines, machines for giving birth to children, which is also a part of this whole Shinzo Abe's politics of reasserting the gender roles, and that is heteronormative family values. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we have quite a few questions. If we can start on the left side of the door.
That's right. The other way around. Oh, already. Okay. Thank you for the questions. One question, I guess it was for me, or not. Okay. So it's quite easy to answer yes. They were all cisgender men. The question by Luo. Zian? Sorry. I don't know if it's a very hard question to to answer. And it's interesting talking about ethics of representations. I don't know what are the assumptions of your question. I'm not sure if I understood clearly. You talk about the reproducing the violence of the words used by the and to reproduce a certain kind of view on people, on relation. I really don't know how to, because it's something new for me to think about. So I think it's a very good insight. But I need time to understand and to discuss about it. Maybe you could help me more to understand what's your thought about that. Thank you.
Okay, regarding the sample, as I explained, this is part of a wider project. We analyzed all the films with queer migrants coming from Muslim backgrounds living in Europe. So we found like 18 films, and we analyzed all of them, but one that we couldn't even reach it because it was like too independent. It was not possible for us to analyze it. And in this case, we only focused our analysis on the films with characters from an Asian origin. So I've mentioned all the films that we have found. Maybe there are more. So if you know more films with characters of Muslim all these filters, it will be great, because we haven't like decided anything else but to analyze all of them. So the last one probably was that we found was that one. Apart from that, yeah. So we analyze here characters with non-normative gender and sexuality. So we didn't apply the categories of gay or lesbian or transgender, because actually most of the movies like were questioning these identities, and they didn't even use these labels. I must say that this is part of a project that included another part where we interviewed migrants from Morocco living in Catalonia, and I realized of my own ethnocentric expectations during the interviews. And I remember that during the interviews at the beginning, it was like a disaster, because I was like asking them, when did you realize that your desire for men, when did you come out? And it was like, they didn't reply. And it was like, what am I doing wrong? And then I realized that their silence was the answer. And that my expectations about the way we in Western countries build our desire, our narrative of desire, of confession, of coming out, didn't apply to them. And they had other strategies of kind of coming out or not coming out that implied that most of them like kind of the family knew, but they didn't verbalize, and it was like a kind of their balance. So it was really interesting for me to be able to understand my own ethnocentric expectations and to be able to criticize them. And the last one is that when I was like listening to my colleagues, I was thinking that I think that we agree with all the critics about Gay International and how Western countries like kind of colonized with gay, lesbian identities and so on. But at the same time, I feel that sometimes there's the risk of like understanding the ways of living sexuality there as pure, no? It's like, and I think that we are seeing here that there's no such clear boundary between Western and Asian or other parts of the globe, that we are more hybrid than we like to know, like to recognize sometimes, no? So, well, I think that it's a risk to think about the purity of other cultures' ways of dealing with sexuality. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, just making sure that it's functioning. Thank you for your comments and questions. And so in response to the first question, what did I learn from my participants? It actually reminds me of a linguistic study that I read way back. It was back in 1997, where the author observed in her findings that in a group session of sharing coming out stories, what she called gay European Americans tend to focus on their inner struggles, like, oh, I cannot be gay, I have to act straight, that kind of inner conflict before coming to terms with their gender identity or their sexuality or sexual orientations, whereas gay Asian Americans in the same group tend not to focus on that, but instead they define coming out as disclosing their sexual orientations to others. That's how I follow, like I trace that line and go into my study. So when I was interviewing my participants, I kind of had this dichotomy in mind, thinking that when I'm interviewing my participants with Asian backgrounds, they should have the same definition of, coming out means coming out to others instead of coming out to self, like that as in a position as opposed to what the therapist asked me. But in the end, like my participant kind of proved me wrong, because even though they might share the same cultural backgrounds, even though they might, the 4 participants that I listed in my slides, they all came from India, but their experiences still shape them differently. So they might take different approaches to what it actually means to come out to them personally. So some of them take an approach more introspective, whereas some others take a more interactive approach, which is about coming out to others. So I think that's what I learned. Even though previous studies have shown that this is the case while interacting with people, the reality is actually more complicated, like way more complicated than that, and everyone has their own unique experience when it comes to coming out. So basically that's what I learned from my participants, and kind of leading to the second questions, and also related to that one about the ethics of representation. I feel like I have to constantly remind myself that I have to be cautious when talking about my participants' coming out stories, because I am in no position to speak on behalf of them. Not just because I'm not from India, but even if I were from India, I do not live their lives. So I can only talk about, so this is what I observed, this is what I think, this is how I analyze it. And at the same time, try not to reinforce or recreate the cultural generalizations, like not trying to make a sweeping statement about, so they are like this, they are like that. So I think that's something that I have to keep in mind regarding, and especially speaking of like colonization, I think coming out, it's really a site where we can observe that happening, because attending another conference in April, one of the keynote speakers mentioned that sexual orientations and gender identity are actually more universal. They are not simply a Western construct or a Western proposition. But back then, when I heard that, I was thinking, but I feel like coming out is not really that universal, because just simply my experience, as well as what I have heard from my friends, my participants, I feel like we all learn about coming out much later in our lives, and especially in a lot of Asian countries, Taiwan, China, Korea, Hong Kong, Japan. The translation for coming out actually is a direct literal translation of coming out. It really says something about, like coming out, it's not indigenous, it's not inherent in Asian countries, in Asian cultures. So I feel like coming out by, especially what we just saw in examples and interviews about their coming out stories, I feel like in a process of integrating themselves, assimilating, they're also adopting the Western discourses, the Western constructs of what it means to coming out, what it means to be a gay man in the US. And can we arguably say that it's a part, like a process of colonization, like modern, like being like, okay, now I identify myself as, with the American culture. And lastly, I want to also address a little bit about the exchange of information and celebrating maybe just one race over the others. I think it's also a dilemma for me, as well as many other researchers and also practitioners working in different settings, that we're constantly dealing with this issue or this, like I said, dilemma of trying not to circulate what's already dominant there, or trying not to impose by saying, so this is coming out, accept it, take it. Now that you're in the US, you have to accept this as coming out. So in response to the idea of exchanging information, I believe we need to kind of alter that, the ways or the flow of circulation by incorporating more like a diverse array of voices. Like, so what do you think coming out means to you personally? Like by asking questions, and then we can get a better understanding of what it means for all of us in this area. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your questions, and I'm trying to like incorporate the question from like two participants. I think like the first question addressing the rejection of a gay couple, is it? I think like, are you referring to a Japanese guy who's like been with a Taiwanese guy for 20 years, and that guy was kind of departed?
The guy mentioned who
Oh, like in my presentation.
Yeah.
Yes, I think like that's a kind of how to put. I think it is kind of general problem, like especially. I think like I've been to like one of the workshop about like basically it's a workshop about people like who identify themselves as LGBT, and they're talking about like the issues and the problems as LGBT living in Japan. And I remember like one of the participants like in the round table, and he was saying that it is kind of difficult to live with a person of the same sex in Japan. And I mean, it's much easier for the people of same sex living together if they're younger, like they can just pass as a roommate or they are just friends. But what if those people like who are like aging, like people in their 40s or 50s, and if they are a same-sex couple, and they like it will be super difficult for them to living together because of I think it is kind of tricky, because like if you want to rent a house, you have to go through the agent, and also the agent is in connect with the owner of the house. I mean, sometimes the agent might not be so caring about like who's living in the house, but sometimes the owner, they care. So I think there will be problems, like even if the agent is okay with the two like same-sex couple, because I mean, like when you sign the contract, they are not asking you like what kind of relationship you have. Like you can just be two friends and wanting to living together. But sometimes the owners, like when you, for instance, when we're about to move into the house, and the owner may ask you some questions, and also it depends what kind of houses you're renting. For instance, the apartment, you probably will not have that kind of issues, but if you're renting the house, like for instance, like traditional Japanese houses, and I think the situation may be tougher in a sense. And regarding LGBT movement in Japan, I think it is still kind of bottom up rather than like top down. So basically, I think like recently there are some openly LGBTQ like politicians coming out, but generally under the LDP, like in Japan is super conservative, and they are kind of permitting their idea about like heterosexism and the masculinity and nationalism. And under the under the governance of LDP, it will be super difficult for, I think it somehow hindered the movement, LGBT movement in Japan. But still, like, there are numbers of NGOs, and especially, like, they can do the movement instead of, like, asking, let's say, the government to do something, like they can do some campaigns, like grassroots activities. I think basically that's what they are doing at this moment by organizing a series of events, like, and trying to kind of raise the awareness of the existence of LGBTQ people and trying to reach those people like who are making the policy or the policymakers and trying to make their voices heard by those policymakers. I think that's what they are doing at this moment. I think the situation won't be changed unless like another party who's more LGBT friendly is in charge of, or like it's a ruling government. And also you're talking about the gay pornography in Japan.
Or you're talking about information.
Yes.
But I was just saying that to me there's a lot more information about Western gay life going to Japan than the other way around. And one of those ways is through the gay pornography industry under late capitalism.
I don't know too much about it, but I think, like, you know, like in Japan they always have that kind of concept of self and other. I think that's a very serious issue. Like they have bars only for foreigners and they have bars only for Japanese people, so like they always have that kind of wall between people, and they also always make like very clear distinction between like self and other. And I think like by exchanging information, like probably we can just tear down the wall if possible. But you know, like the pornography, especially I don't know how to answer that. Yeah, but maybe we can talk about that later.
Thank you everyone for the questions. We are considerably over time, so I'd like to thank our panelists for this wonderful panel.
All right, thank you again. Thanks, Eddie, and thank you to the Birkbeck School of Law. So clearly we're running a little late. If I can ask you guys, so